Hi everyone. Welcome to the Womenomics video about the Australian economy, which is the first video in our investment fundamental series. I really wanted to delve into understanding the dynamics of an economy and specifically the Australian economy before we explore investment fundamentals, because so many people focus on the mechanics of investing and which shares to invest in, but having context around what drives an economy and how all the pieces come together is a really great framework to start with. So that's where we'll begin. By way of disclosure, I have stripped back a lot of detail about what happens in the Australian economy because there are a lot of moving parts, and so I do apologise for keeping it very rudimentary, but I really just wanted to focus on the core parts. Naturally, an economy is more complex than what I'm going to be describing it as in this video, but I really think this video covers all the key nuts and bolts to make it very clear. So in summary, this is everything you need to know or understand about the Australian economy before starting your personal investment journey. So let's get started.
What is an economy? Great question. Well, in very short form, an economy is a system of organizations and institutions that are involved in the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services and the supply of money. So it's really a machine. The reason it's important to understand the state of the Australian economy before investing, or what's happening, if you will, is because whether an economy is growing or shrinking or stagnating or treading water, it will give you a lot of information about whether it is an ideal time to invest, whether you may need to hold off and wait, or just review to see if there are trends to really get a sense of what's happening. That's why we start with economic fundamentals. So, therefore, what is, I guess, a healthy economy? How do we know if the economy is healthy? Well, I'm glad you asked. That is the whole point of this presentation. So let's start with looking at who the key players are. In an economy, there is always a central bank, and the central bank is responsible for what we call monetary policy. There is also a central government, and the central government is responsible for fiscal policy. These two policies are very key to watch and understand, and these two institutions make regular updates and announcements about what is the state of both monetary and fiscal policy. And we'll come back to these in a moment. The next group is the group of consumers. So that would arguably be all of us. We are households who consume goods and services, and we also supply labor to the next group, which is the producers. And the producers are the businesses or organizations who use all the resources, so the labor, land, capital, and any other items, to produce the goods and services that we use. So that in a nutshell is the core players to an economy. Now let's delve into each of these a little more. Coming back to the central bank, so in Australia, the central bank is called the Reserve Bank of Australia. You'll have heard about it in the media referred to as the RBA. The RBA makes a really important announcement on the first Tuesday of every month, and that announcement is what the cash rate will be. That's really critical because the aim of the Reserve Bank, or the RBA, is to set the cash rate at a level that will effectively drive Australia's inflation towards an agreed medium-term target. And that target is currently 2 to 3%. And that entire process is called, that's what monetary policy is. Now we're going to come back to inflation, but just diving back into the cash rate setting. So when the Reserve Bank sets the cash rate, all other rates follow suit. So for example, if the Reserve Bank or the RBA makes an announcement on the first Tuesday of, say, February, that interest rates are going to be, or the cash rate is going to move up what they call 0.25% basis points, or 1/4%, so 25 basis points, That means the cash rate is moving slightly upwards, and therefore mortgage rates, at-call bank account rates, term deposit rates, all other rates across Australia will adjust. Now, not all of them will equally move in line with the Reserve Bank or the RBA cash rate. Generally, banks do like to move in step with the Reserve Bank cash rate, but in the last 2 years, interestingly, that hasn't always been the case. But it's just a good one to watch. So if you already have a mortgage, or conversely with your at-call bank accounts and your term deposits or anything else that is linked to an interest rate, knowing what the Reserve Bank decides on the first Tuesday of every month is a really useful habit to get into. To be fair, it usually is announced at about I think in the mid-afternoon, 2 or 3 o'clock. And then that night on the news it's talked about. So you'll usually pick it up, and it's usually also in the papers as well. But it's still good to log on to the Reserve Bank website and have a look. And if you're feeling really game, I would recommend reading through the detailed announcement, because the Reserve Bank goes into more information about why they've made that decision. That gives you, again, a good sense of the state of the economy. Quick disclosure before we move on from this group, in my humble opinion, the Reserve Bank website is a really, really good source of information about the state of the Australian economy. To be upfront, it is quite data driven, but if you read that monthly cash rate announcement, it's a really, really interesting document to read, and it's very neutral. So there's no rhyme or reason as to why the Reserve Bank might sway you to do X or Y. They're just neutral and reporting data and information, and in my view, again, I do believe they have the best interests of the general public at heart, and they try to phrase everything so that it is clear and easy to understand. So I would highly recommend reviewing their website. Coming next to the central government. So in Australia, the central government is referred to as the federal government as opposed to state and local government. So apart from setting laws and other functions, the federal government spends money, and that would be on projects like infrastructure, highways, ports, railways, and of course, the federal government collects revenue, known as taxes, and it can adjust the level of both of these activities, which, as you can get a sense, influences the economy. So the more the government spends, the more it stimulates jobs, it creates projects that encourages businesses to be involved, to provide services, and equally, depending on the rate at which they collect taxes, and naturally, I'd imagine most people would like them to be very low, but of course, collecting those taxes means they have revenue to spend. So you can see the higher the tax rate, the less income we would have to spend, the lower the tax rate, or if there are other concessions they make or incentives, that will, I guess, in turn adjust our surplus income to spend. So this whole process of adjusting spending and revenue collection is called fiscal policy. The next group is the consumers, and this is what a lot of economists refer to as households. So this group consumes goods and services in exchange for cash, credit, or financial assets, which collectively are known as capital. And the household group, or the consumer group, also provides labour, and the level of employment and the wage growth that is currently underway, that all impacts the demand by consumers for goods and services and how much they are willing to spend. So if, for example, employment is really high or really strong, and there's actually a lot of competition by businesses to employ, because if we've got a really strong employment market, it means people have much more choice in their job applications. So it means employers have to offer perhaps higher wage or increasing wage over a number of years, or incentive bonuses. So all of that competition for employment of the labour force and the wage growth means consumers have more money to spend, and that in turn drives the demand for goods and services, which is very positive. Conversely, we have the producers, And they are collectively called or known as the businesses, the organizations, the manufacturers, and arguably the government is also a producer, but they are the group who produce, they create the goods and the services to be consumed by the households, the consumers. The producers, they need resources and labor, and in exchange for this, they will pay either wages or capital to the labor force for their time, their work, and their effort. The demand for goods and services, of course, by households impacts the employment rate and the wage levels, which we just talked about. So you can see between the consumers and producers, there's quite a highly interlinked relationship. Let's put this into practice. Now let's assume the central bank has set a low cash rate, so therefore the interest rates on mortgages, on borrowings, on at-call cash accounts, on term deposits is low. And equally, the central government has lowered tax rates and they're actually spending a lot on infrastructure or projects or public goods. What would most likely happen here is that employment would be higher because with the government spending on infrastructure, there would be more need by businesses and organizations to hire to deliver on these competitive tendered projects. Lower taxes means there would be more, consumption of goods and services. So therefore businesses want to create more goods and services to meet this demand. So it has a positive flow-on effect. And conversely, the producers need more labor, which means they want to compete for the people who they want to hire. So there might be wage growth. So it's a really positive stimulation, if you will, when looking at what the central bank and the central government's monetary and fiscal policy has, in effect, done to the economy. This would be what we'd call an overstimulated economy. On the flip side, if the central bank sets a high cash rate, so therefore you've got high mortgages, high interest rates on cash accounts and term deposits, and then the central government has high tax rates and does not spend a lot on infrastructure, you can probably get a sense that what this would cause is, well, given there's no to low infrastructure projects being built, the government spend being low would cause there to be less demand for employment. With higher taxes, it would also mean that there would be less incentive for people to spend because they're trying to meet their high tax bills and there's less employment, so they need to be able to put food on the table, pay their electricity bills, and probably will not spend as much on general excess goods and services, just the bare basics. So therefore, the producers are not going to be needing to produce as much goods and services because the consumer demand will be lower, and equally because the government isn't spending a lot on projects or infrastructure, they will not need, the producers that is, will not need as much labour to complete all those projects. So it has a dampening effect, if you will, around the economy, and this is what we call an understimulated economy. What these phases that I've just described, an overstimulated economy and an understimulated economy, they're not all happening at the same time. The economy moves arguably in a cyclical nature. So with that in mind, what is then an economic cycle? Well, let's take a look through a visual representation. Now, this graph is a very good looking cyclical movement of an economy. Most economic cycles do not look as clean as this. But in summary, because of the actions taken by the Reserve Bank with monetary policy and the federal government through its use of fiscal policy, we get this expanding and contraction movement, which looks like the following. So starting in 2002, we're using a hypothetical time period here. The economy, you can see, starts to contract as we move through to 2004 and 2005 and reaches a trough period. Then moving forward over the next couple of years, it starts to expand, and we reach a peak period in about 2010 or 11. We then move downwards again into a contraction period, and by the time we reach about 2017, we're in a trough period. And then moving forward into 2020, we're expanding again. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a completely fictitious example, but it just highlights what an economic cycle terminology is, how an economic cycle can move. And throughout this economic cycle, depending on what is causing the downwards movements or the upwards movements, the Reserve Bank or the federal government will step in to use monetary policy and fiscal policy to impact where the economy is heading. So using the graph that we have, let's say as the contraction back in 2002 is starting to happen, the Reserve Bank may progressively lower interest rates in an attempt to stimulate people borrowing money to buy houses or to do a more business expansion through, acquiring assets. So it's trying to stimulate growth. And then as the trough period starts to come through, the federal government, conversely, might look to spend more money. It might increase taxes to raise more revenue. Whatever action it does take, it is attempting to encourage more employment and businesses. And I'd argue that that would be done mostly through itself taking on debt to be able to afford projects, which in turn feeds through to businesses and organizations who want to win the contracts to build whatever asset it is. Let's say it's a bridge or a tollway, and then they in turn have to go and employ more people. Then as that combination of monetary policy and fiscal policy really pushes through, the economy expands. And as the economy starts to really take off, you might find that the Reserve Bank starts to raise interest rates, because that will gradually discourage people to borrow as much, and that will slow down or the overheated potential nature of the economy. Conversely, the federal government, as we reach the peak period, may look to reduce the amount of spend it's undertaking. It may therefore reduce the amount of projects, because if interest rates have increased, spending for the government or through borrowing is also becoming expensive, and these actions will perhaps cause the economy to contract. But again, as it's starting to approach a trough period, the Reserve Bank again may adjust interest rates to increase them so that people are encouraged to borrow, and on it goes. So you can see the way in which these two key players interact with the economy to try and cause effects to happen. But the rate in which monetary policy or fiscal policy feeds through to an economy, there's usually what we call delays or lags. So it's hard for the Reserve Bank and the federal government to know for sure the impact of the decisions it has made and how that's flowed through to the economy. And that's often why the two players will not be perfectly timing their use of monetary policy or fiscal policy, and they need to constantly adjust as time unfolds. So with all of this in mind then, how do we know where an economy is in the cycle? Because as you may recall from the beginning of this presentation, we talked about the importance of understanding the state of an economy as being a key reason why you might invest, knowing that it's an ideal time, or whether you may hold off and just continue to monitor. So knowing where you are in an economic cycle is really helpful to understand whether the time is opportunistic to invest. So this is where inflation comes back into discussion. There are what we call key economic indicators. And these key economic indicators are how an individual can read an economy. So let's take a look at a few of them. Now, this list is not all inclusive, but there are a number that are quite important to look at, and I've summarized a few of them here. The first one is what we call Consumer Price Index. Without going into too much detail, in summary, Consumer Price Index measures a basket of goods, and that basket of goods has been predetermined a long time ago, but that the basket of goods is meant to represent what an average consumer would buy, and over a number of years it tracks the price of those goods to measure the increase in price over time, or what we call the inflation. So Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is how you can read where inflation is. So our price is moving upwards, and therefore we're getting high inflation or higher inflation. So inflation is increasing, which means people are spending more and therefore goods are becoming more expensive. Or is there what we call stagflation, where inflation is stagnating or even decreasing? If inflation is moving upwards, that tends to be a good measure that an economy is expanding. But we don't want inflation to become extreme, where you get hyperinflation and prices of goods become so expensive, it's very hard for a consumer to be able to afford those goods. That's why the Reserve Bank works carefully to keep inflation to the best of its ability in a band of between 2 to 3%. That's a reasonable level of inflation, and it means the economy isn't overheating or we're not getting hyperinflation. The next indicator is gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is effectively the sum total of what a country is producing. So when people talk about the growth of gross domestic product, or GDP, that measures, if you will, the production of an economy and how we are growing over time. We want to see GDP grow. We've talked about the cash rate already, but that is still a very good economic indicator. For example, at present time in Australia, our cash rate is at 1.5%. That is unprecedentedly low. We have never had a cash rate this low before. If a cash rate gets to zero, or as we've seen in parts of Europe, negative, and that is a very unusual situation to be in. It means the Reserve Bank, or a central bank, has nowhere to go in terms of being able to stimulate an economy. You can't lower rates any more than, well, you can. You can go much more into the negative if you'd like, but you're effectively, therefore, charging people to keep cash in a bank, which is just incredibly unusual, which, really discourages people from keeping cash, and that's the point. The lower the interest rate, the less likely people are to put cash in a bank account, because you can't earn anything on keeping that cash. You are most likely better off spending it or investing it into assets that'll give you a better return. That's why if a central bank, in our case in Australia, the Reserve Bank, reduces interest rates, it disincentivizes people to save cash, and it usually incentivizes people to borrow. The next economic indicator that's very important to watch is the unemployment rate. We want to know how full, if you will, an employment market is in a particular country. The higher the level of employment, the more in demand the labour force is, meaning there's more work to be done, productivity is high. But if unemployment starts to grow, it means there are less people in the employment market, meaning there's less goods being produced. Therefore, that's a bit of a concern. So an unemployment rate of where we are now, which is at about 5%, is pretty good. That you can never get 0% unemployment. There's always going to be some small percentage of people that for one reason or another will be unemployed. But an unemployment rate of, say, 5% is very good. The next economic indicator to watch for is wage growth. That is really important because we want to see people's wages over time growing. For example, if inflation, or CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, is growing at, let's say inflation is at 3 or 4%, so it's slightly above the Reserve Bank's target band. But wage growth, so the income or salary people are paid on average, is only growing at 2%. If inflation is higher than wage growth, over time, it means people will be able to afford less with their income because their wage isn't growing at a rate to keep up with inflation. So their wage, in effect, devalues over time. That's not a good position to be in. You want to see wage growth grow, at least if you can, in line with inflation. The next economic indicator to watch with interest is the exchange rate. We want to know what our dollar can buy in another country. So if our dollar is very strong, you might recall a number of years ago, our dollar in Australia was on parity. It equaled the US dollar. Now that was an incredibly good time to travel to the US. Our dollar bought $1, so the goods were on par. Not necessarily the price of goods, but our dollar for their dollar. Even going back more years ago, when the US dollar was double ours, so 50 cents Australia bought $1, it was much more expensive to travel to the US. So watching the exchange rate is really important as an economic indicator. The next economic indicator to look for is household consumption, so the rate at which households are consuming goods. If household consumption is low, it means households are saving, which means their cash isn't being circulated into the economy through buying items, which means that businesses aren't able to produce as much. And arguably, at the end of the day, to get a really productive economy, you want households to be consuming, because therefore gross domestic product increases, employment increases, so unemployment goes down. It's usually a positive thing. If households are not spending, you really want to understand why. What is causing that? If they're paying down debt, that's an interesting scenario, versus if they're concerned about the Australian economy and are buying abroad instead, for whatever various reason, that's also very interesting to understand. So it may change the way you look at how you might invest in the Australian economy. The last economic indicator we're going to touch on today is balance of trade. What that's really looking at is Australia, or are Australians importing more than they're exporting? I can't see why an economy would want to be a net importer. I'd argue economies want to be a net exporter. So looking at whether Australia is sending out or exporting goods more than they're importing is a really, really useful economic indicator to watch. So with those 8 in mind, I would highly encourage you to keep your ears to the ground and your eyes open. When you hear these talked about, really listen to what it is that they're saying. Really look at, well, what is CPI? Is inflation 2 to 3%? If it's higher than that, it generally means the economy is growing faster than what the Reserve Bank would like it to. If it's lower than that, it means the economy is growing at a slower rate than what the Reserve Bank would want it to, and so on and so forth. Now, a really good snapshot to look at is actually found on the Reserve Bank website, and I've put a screenshot of it here. It's a really attractive green color. They have different colors on a regular basis, but the Reserve Bank publishes this PDF document, this snapshot of key economic indicators every month. So if you want a quick idea of what's happening in the economy, please go to their website, and I will walk you through that in a moment, and have a look at this. You don't need to read through absolutely every announcement, and believe me, there's plenty of them with lots of charts and data. This is a good one. Now, looking at the one that I have here for December 2018, to understand what is happening, a cash rate of 1.5% being the lowest rate Australia has ever had means that the Reserve Bank is doing its very best to encourage consumers to borrow money. So we really want to see consumers buying properties or cars, or investing in a share portfolio, or buying more technology, TVs, whatever have you. And equally, businesses to borrow money, so to buy more assets, to expand their product lines. An inflation rate of 1.9% is actually at the lower range of the medium-term target. And when you couple that with wage growth of about 2.3%, again, that's relatively low as well, not too bad. But it's really interesting to watch these two. At least for now, wage growth is higher, slightly, than inflation. That's important. Gross domestic product, or economic growth, or GDP, 2.8% is reasonable. If you look down the bottom of that green sheet, it shows you that China's GDP growth of 6.5% is clearly much higher. Now, we know China's has been even higher than that before, but you can see comparatively from an economic strength perspective, or economic growth perspective, Ours at 2.8% versus China's at 6.5% tells you that China is growing much faster, more than 2 times faster. So the Australian economy, when looking at all these factors, it's growing, but slowly. As I mentioned before, this snapshot, amongst a lot of others, can be found at the following address. So www.rba.gov.au/snapshots. I would highly recommend looking at it. There's, as you can see, the green one at the top, so key economic indicators. You just click on that and it will pop up that PDF. There are others, but it's up to you if you want to have a look at those. So that brings us to the end of the presentation today. That is the Australian economy in 30 minutes. I really hope you found this incredibly helpful. I would gladly welcome feedback, so please feel free to send me a message or an email. If there's anything more you'd like to better understand, or if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, I look forward to speaking with you all very soon. Thank you.